Introduction. The Gladiator's arrival. The sky above the planet was a dark, eerie shade of purple as the massive ship descended through the atmosphere. It was unlike any spacecraft that humanity had ever seen. The hull was sleek, shining with a metallic sheen, and it hummed with a low, rumbling sound as it made its way toward the landing zone. Below, the people of the colony watched with bated breath. No one knew who was aboard or why they had come, but everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. As the ship touched down, a thick cloud of dust and smoke billowed into the air, clouding the view of the onlookers. The colony, located on the outskirts of a vast, desolate world, had seen its fair share of visitors, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to step off that ship. The first thing that emerged was the sound. Heavy footsteps, each one echoing through the barren land like thunder. The ground beneath seemed to shake with every step, and soon a hulking shadow appeared through the smoke. It was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, towering above the humans who stared in awe and fear. The creature that stood before them wasn't human, nor did it look anything like the aliens the humans had encountered in the past. Its body was muscular, covered in thick, battle-scarred armor that glinted under the dim light of the planet's twin moons. This wasn't just any alien. This was a gladiator. Her face, or what could be called a face, was obscured by a dark helmet. Her eyes, glowing red beneath the surface, scanned the crowd like a predator looking for prey. She had the posture of someone who had seen countless battles, someone who had fought in the fiercest arenas of the galaxy. Her hands were wrapped around the hilt of a massive weapon, a sword-like blade that looked as though it could cut through steel with ease. She was bound by thick chains, restraining her movements, but it was clear that the chains were a mere formality. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was a warrior, someone whose strength could tear through her bonds with ease if she chose to. The humans watched, paralyzed with a mixture of awe and fear. They had no idea why this creature had come, or what she wanted, but one thing was certain: this was not someone who could be easily controlled. The Gladiator had a reputation that echoed across the stars, a name spoken in hushed whispers in the darkest corners of the galaxy. She was known for her brutal victories in the arena, for her ability to crush anyone who dared challenge her. Her strength was legendary, and her presence commanded respect or fear. The human commander, a tall and calm man named Captain Mark Sloan, stepped forward. He was the one who had been tasked with overseeing the arrival of this gladiator. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. He had faced difficult situations before, but nothing like this. The gladiator's reputation had reached him even before the signal had been intercepted. This was not just a prisoner being brought to their world. It was a challenge. Mark had heard the stories. The gladiator was a force to be reckoned with, a warrior who had fought in countless battles across the galaxy. She was feared by her enemies and admired by her fellow gladiators. But the question was, why had she been brought to this peaceful colony? Why had she been chained and transported like an animal? The chains rattled as the gladiator took another step forward. Her eyes never left Mark as she moved, her gaze cold and calculating. The air was thick with tension. The people of the colony, who had never seen such an imposing figure before, watched in silence. Mark knew that the fate of the colony rested on what happened next. The gladiator stopped just a few feet away from Mark. She was taller than him, her gaze almost intimidating. Despite the chains that bound her, she stood with an air of confidence, as though she knew she could break free at any moment. The chains were a symbol, not a prison. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew that he had to speak. He had to show the gladiator that he wasn't afraid, that he was in control of this situation. He stepped forward, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. "We don't want to fight you," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't know why you're here, but we'll figure this out. We'll work together." The gladiator didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her expression was unreadable, but her stance was still that of a fighter, ready to act at any moment. Mark could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. The air was thick with the tension of an unknown future. No one knew what would happen next. The Gladiator had arrived, and with her, a new chapter was about to be written in the galaxy's history. The questions lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Why was she here? What did she want? And more importantly, who would have the courage to tame her? As Mark looked up at the towering Gladiator, he felt a chill run down his spine. The galaxy was about to change. But what would that change bring? Would humanity survive, or would the Gladiator bring about their destruction? Only time would tell. But for now, one thing was certain. The war had just begun, and the Gladiator had arrived, ready for whatever came next. The human commander's decision. The quiet of the colony was shattered as the Gladiator's heavy footsteps echoed across the barren land. The dust from the ship's landing still hung in the air, obscuring the view of the people who had gathered to witness the arrival. Commander Mark Sloan stood in the middle of the chaos, his mind racing, but his body steady. He knew that what had just landed on their doorstep was no ordinary enemy, but a force of nature that could tear apart everything in its path. The Gladiator's reputation had reached every corner of the galaxy. Her name, spoken in fearful whispers across worlds, was that of a living legend. She was an undefeated champion, feared by countless species for her strength, her savagery, and her unmatched skill in combat. She had fought in arenas on distant planets, where warriors from every race came to test their might. And yet now she was here, chained like an animal, with no clear purpose other than to be delivered to a strange, remote colony at the edge of human space. Mark had been chosen to deal with her. He was a man who had led his troops through difficult missions, who had faced threats both alien and human. But this was different. He wasn't just leading soldiers into battle. He was facing the unknown. This wasn't a soldier he was tasked with commanding. This was a gladiator, a living weapon who had never known mercy, who had spent her entire life in combat. The thought of facing her filled Mark with a deep unease, but he couldn't show it. Not now. Mark turned to his team, who stood nearby, their faces etched with concern. His second in command, Lieutenant Sarah Green, was the first to speak. "Commander, do you really think we can control her? She's not just any prisoner. She's a gladiator. They're bred for battle." Mark nodded slowly. He knew she was right. "I don't know if we can control her, but we have to try." The truth was, Mark wasn't sure if control was even possible. The gladiator's size, her power, her violent history, all of it made her seem like an unstoppable force. But something inside him told him that brute strength alone wouldn't be enough to tame her. The only way forward was to outthink her, to find a way to connect with her on a deeper level. Mark had read the reports from the other colonies. No one had succeeded in taming the gladiator yet, but no one had tried using strategy. Maybe that was where humanity's strength lay, not in physical dominance, but in ingenuity, in courage, in heart. "We can't just keep her locked up," Mark said, his voice firm. "We have to find a way to communicate, to understand why she's here." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded. She trusted Mark, even if she didn't fully agree with his plan. The team had been through too much together to doubt him now. As Mark turned to look at the gladiator again, he saw her standing still, her glowing eyes fixed on him. The chains that bound her to the ship clinked softly with each movement she made, a constant reminder of her power and restraint. She was waiting for something or someone to make the next move. Mark's heart beat faster as he walked toward her, each step bringing him closer to the unknown. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for a brief second he thought about turning back. But he couldn't. Not now. The fate of the colony, perhaps even the fate of humanity itself, depended on his actions. As he approached, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace, hoping to convey that he wasn't a threat. His mind raced with possibilities. What if she attacked? What if she refused to listen? Mark's hand hovered just above the sidearm on his belt, a reminder of the danger he was walking into. But he had to be brave. He had to lead. "Listen," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "I don't know why you're here, or what your mission is, but I need you to understand. This is a peaceful colony. We don't want to fight. We just want to understand." The gladiator's eyes narrowed as she studied him, her gaze cold and calculating. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, an immovable wall of power and mystery. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. It was clear that this was a creature who had been through things most humans could never imagine. Her life had been one of endless fighting, of violence and survival. What could possibly make her listen to him? Mark stood in silence for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. He needed to make her see that they weren't like the others, humans who had sent her here as a prisoner, to be chained and bound. He needed to appeal to something deeper. "You don't have to be a prisoner anymore," Mark said, his voice softer now. "You don't have to fight. We can help you. We can give you a new purpose, but we need your help too." The gladiator's eyes flickered for a brief moment, a subtle change that Mark almost missed. Did she understand him? Was there a flicker of something behind those cold eyes, a glimmer of curiosity? Mark's words hung in the air, unanswered, but the tension was palpable. The gladiator remained silent, unmoving, her presence overwhelming. He couldn't tell if she was considering his words or if she was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. But Mark wasn't ready to back down. He would not let fear control him. He had made his decision. And now it was up to him to prove that humanity had the courage to face this warrior, this living legend. First confrontation. Taming the beast. The air was thick with tension as Commander Mark Sloan approached the gladiator, every step measured, every move deliberate. The people around him stood frozen, watching in silence, waiting for something to happen. The gladiator stood tall, her body like a wall of muscle and armor, chained but not broken. The chains rattled lightly as she shifted, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. Her eyes, glowing a deep crimson beneath her helmet, were locked onto Mark, her gaze calculating, predatory. Mark's pulse quickened, but he did his best to mask his fear. He had faced many battles in his life, but nothing like this. The stories of the gladiator's brutal victories were legend, told in hushed voices across galaxies. She had defeated warriors from species as varied as they were deadly. She had crushed hopes, broken armies, and left countless challengers dead in her wake. And now she stood before him, bound and restrained, but as dangerous as ever. His mission was clear: tame her, or at the very least, prevent her from causing destruction. He needed to find a way to communicate with her, to show her that humans weren't her enemies. But deep inside, Mark knew he was not dealing with a prisoner. This wasn't someone who could be simply locked away or silenced. This was a gladiator, a warrior who had lived for one thing: combat. "Listen to me," Mark spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I know you've been through more than most could ever imagine, but we don't want to fight you. We just need to understand why you're here." The gladiator's only response was the faintest twitch of her head, a signal that she was listening. But she didn't speak, didn't make any move to acknowledge his words. Mark felt the weight of her silence, pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He knew she could easily tear through her chains, but she hadn't. Was she waiting for something? Or perhaps, was she studying him as much as he was studying her? Mark glanced over his shoulder at Sarah Green, his second in command. She was watching with a skeptical expression, her hand still hovering near her sidearm. Mark could feel the tension mounting behind him. His team was ready to act at the slightest sign of aggression from the gladiator, but he didn't want that. He wanted peace, a chance to understand the creature who stood before him. Turning back to the gladiator, Mark took another step forward, slowly closing the distance between them. He didn't reach for his weapon, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to offer you something different. A chance at a new life. A life without chains." The gladiator's crimson eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Mark thought he saw something. maybe curiosity, maybe hesitation, but just as quickly her gaze hardened again, as though she had made her decision. Without warning, the gladiator moved. She surged forward with the speed and power of a beast, her chains clinking violently as she attempted to lunge at Mark. Her strength was immeasurable, and in that split second, Mark could see the raw force that had made her so feared. It was a terrifying sight, but Mark was ready. With lightning reflexes, Mark dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the gladiator's violent advance. He rolled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The gladiator, still bound by chains, swung her weapon in an arc, the massive blade cutting through the air with a hiss. It was a dangerous, precise strike, a testament to her combat training. "Stop!" Mark shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the gladiator's fury. She swung again, her movements fluid and controlled, but Mark was no longer focused on the weapon. He focused on her reactions, on the pattern of her strikes. She wasn't just attacking blindly. There was a rhythm to her movements, a method behind her aggression. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't outmuscle her. She was too strong, but he could outthink her. He had to. He ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the gladiator's swings. His mind worked quickly, analyzing her every move. He had to find a weakness, a crack in her armor, something he could use. She wasn't just a beast. She was a warrior, and every warrior had their limits. The gladiator paused for a moment, her glowing eyes fixed on Mark. She was breathing heavily, the chains around her arms now taut as she struggled to bring her weapon back for another strike. Mark could see the tension in her muscles, the exhaustion beginning to show. She wasn't used to being restrained. She wasn't used to holding back. "Listen to me," Mark called again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm not your enemy. I know you've been used. But this is your chance to make your own choices. You don't have to be a weapon anymore." The gladiator hesitated. Her weapon lowered slightly, just enough to indicate that she was considering his words. It was a fleeting moment, a small crack in her armor, but it was enough. Mark seized the opportunity. He closed the distance again, slowly, cautiously, keeping his eyes locked on hers. This time, the gladiator didn't react with aggression. She stood still, her breathing slowing as she watched him. "Take a step back," Mark said gently, raising his hand in a calming gesture. "You're not a weapon. You're more than that." The gladiator's eyes narrowed, as if searching for deception in his words. But Mark stood firm. He didn't flinch. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. He had to prove to her that humanity had more to offer than violence. Seconds passed like hours, the silence between them growing heavier. Finally, the gladiator released a low growl, a deep rumble that came from deep within her chest. She stood tall, her chains still holding her back, but for the first time, she didn't seem like she was about to destroy everything in her path. Mark didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this was the first step. The battle wasn't over, but it was far from lost. The human strategy. Commander Mark Sloan stood quietly, his eyes never leaving the gladiator. Despite the tension in the air, a small flicker of hope sparked inside him. The gladiator hadn't attacked, hadn't lashed out again. That brief pause, when she lowered her weapon, even if just for a moment, meant something. He could sense it. She was testing him, just as he was testing her. Mark's mind was racing. The first confrontation had proven something vital. Brute force wouldn't work on her. He wasn't dealing with a typical prisoner. The gladiator wasn't someone who could be subdued with threats or force alone. She had lived through a lifetime of violence, had survived countless battles and wars, and had emerged victorious every time. If he was going to make any headway, he needed a strategy. And he needed to understand her, beyond her role as a weapon, beyond her chains. The team gathered around him, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Sarah Green, his second in command, stepped forward, her arms crossed over her chest. She had witnessed the gladiator's incredible strength firsthand and knew just how dangerous she could be. "Mark, you saw it yourself. She nearly killed you. How are we supposed to handle her? She's a monster. Mark looked at Sarah, his face set in a determined expression. She's not a monster. She's a soldier, a gladiator. And like every soldier, she has a mind, a purpose, a reason for everything she does. We just have to find a way to reach it. Sarah's brow furrowed. You think she's capable of reasoning? After everything she's been through? I do, Mark said firmly. She might not be human, but that doesn't mean she doesn't have the capacity for something more. We've only seen her rage, her violence. We haven't seen her need, her fear, or her hope. That's what we need to find. Mark turned to the rest of his crew, his thoughts forming into a plan. If he was going to break through to the gladiator, he needed to understand her in a way that no one had before. He needed to see her not as a prisoner, not as a weapon, but as a living being. Someone who had been conditioned by years of conflict, yes, but who might still have the potential for something greater. Sarah, Mark continued, I need you to bring me everything we know about her. Any information, any details from her past battles, her interactions with others. We need to understand what makes her tick, what drives her. Sarah hesitated for a moment, before nodding and heading toward the ship's control center. Mark watched her leave, then turned his attention back to the gladiator. She stood motionless, her glowing red eyes still fixed on him. The chains that bound her were tight, but they were no match for the raw power she possessed. Mark knew the next step would be delicate. If he failed, it could be disastrous. In the hours that followed, Mark studied the data Sarah had gathered. The gladiator's history was as brutal as he expected. She had fought in countless arenas, where the strongest and most ruthless warriors from all corners of the galaxy came to prove their worth. She had never been defeated, and that was something that made her feared across the stars. She had known nothing but combat. Until now. Mark sifted through every scrap of information. One fact stood out. The gladiator had once fought in a unique series of one-on-one challenges, where the victor was not decided by strength alone, but by something deeper, strategy, cunning, and even empathy. In the end, it wasn't the strongest warrior who always won. It was the one who could outthink their opponent. That was what Mark needed to tap into. This gladiator wasn't just a monster of strength. She was a survivor, a fighter who understood the value of strategy. The next day, Mark put his plan into motion. All right, he began, addressing his team. We're going to approach this differently. No more brute force. We'll start with small steps. I'm going to try to communicate with her, but this time, we'll do it on her terms. Sarah and the others exchanged nervous glances. They were used to Mark's tactical thinking. But this was new territory. I'm going to give her something she hasn't had in a long time, Mark continued. A choice. We're going to offer her a challenge, something that isn't about violence, but about something she can control. A game of sorts. If she succeeds, she gains something valuable. If she fails, we'll have to consider other options. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked, her tone serious. What if she sees this as a sign of weakness? She won't, Mark said with confidence. This is a challenge for her, a test of strategy, not strength. We're showing her that there's more to this world than just combat, and we're going to respect her intellect. Mark knew this approach was risky. The gladiator had been trained to think like a warrior, to see the world in terms of battle and dominance. But if Mark could offer her a challenge she could control, he hoped it would break through her defensive exterior. A challenge of intellect, of wit, something that would appeal to her as much as her need for victory. As the plan unfolded, Mark approached the gladiator once more. This time, he brought with him something unexpected. A simple board game, something humanity had used for centuries to test minds and sharpen strategy. It was an old game, chess. A game of calculation, planning, and foresight. No weapons, no violence, just the mind. The gladiator eyed the game with suspicion as Mark placed the board before her. Her eyes flickered to him, then to the pieces on the board, her expression unreadable. The chains still bound her, but Mark knew this was her chance. It was his chance to prove that there was more to her than just the brute force of her existence. "Let's see if you can outsmart me," Mark said quietly, taking the seat across from her. The gladiator didn't speak. She simply studied the board, her eyes narrowing as she calculated her first move. And for the first time, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could reach her. The breakthrough moment. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What started as a tense standoff, filled with uncertainty and fear, was slowly transforming into something else, something unexpected. Commander Mark Sloan sat across from the gladiator, watching her carefully as she studied the chessboard. The game was simple in its appearance, but deep in its complexity. Mark had chosen it because it demanded intellect and foresight, qualities that, despite her violent past, he believed the gladiator might possess. The tension in the air was thick as both players carefully considered their moves. The gladiator's hands were steady, her chains rattling faintly as she reached for a piece. The first few moments had been silent, with her only making the slightest of movements, as though testing the boundaries of this strange new interaction. Mark had expected a quick, impulsive attack, but instead, she sat there, her gaze locked on the board. She wasn't moving randomly. She was thinking. For the first time, Mark saw something beyond the raw, uncontrollable fury he had come to associate with her. There was intelligence in her eyes, a depth that wasn't simply about the violence of the arena. She was calculating, anticipating his next move, looking at the bigger picture. It was a small change, but it was enough to fill Mark with cautious optimism. "This is your move," Mark said, his voice steady as he gestured to the board. The gladiator's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to the game. She was still quiet, but Mark didn't expect her to speak. Words were unnecessary. What mattered now was the challenge. It was her chance to regain some semblance of control, to show that she could be more than the weapon others had created her to be. Mark moved his piece, shifting his knight across the board. He watched closely as she analyzed his move, her glowing red eyes narrowing as she considered her response. There was something about the way she focused, like a predator on the hunt, calculating the best route to victory. He had expected her to be brash, to react with sheer aggression, but instead, she was patient. She was thinking. She reached for one of her pieces, her chains clinking as she moved it forward with precision. Mark raised an eyebrow. She had made a move that, while subtle, showed a deep understanding of strategy. She wasn't just playing the game. She was playing him. Mark smiled to himself. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. As the game continued, Mark could feel the tension in the room slowly beginning to ease. He wasn't just facing a gladiator anymore. He was facing someone who was capable of more than just destruction. She was capable of intelligence, of understanding. She had been shaped by war, but now, in this moment, she was playing a game that didn't require bloodshed. She was learning a new kind of fight, a fight for control, for strategy, for something other than dominance. Minutes passed like hours, and the game unfolded with surprising fluidity. Mark moved his pieces, carefully testing her, seeing how she reacted to each decision. He had expected to be the one with the upper hand, but the gladiator was proving to be a formidable opponent. She was outthinking him at every turn, her eyes darting from one piece to another as she devised her next move. It was clear she had been trained for this, not in the way of warfare, but in the way of the mind. Her battles had always been physical, but this was a different kind of challenge, and she was rising to it. As the game drew to a close, Mark's heart raced. He had underestimated her. With one swift move, the gladiator cornered his king. It was a checkmate. She had won. Mark sat back, taking a deep breath. For a moment, he felt a sense of awe wash over him. This gladiator, who had been feared for her strength and brutality, had just beaten him at a game that required careful thought and strategy. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had proven something that Mark hadn't expected, that beneath the surface of the warrior, there was a mind capable of more than violence. The gladiator's eyes locked onto his as she sat back, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken a word throughout the game, but in her silence, she had communicated something far more powerful. She had accepted the challenge. She had played his game, and she had won. But in doing so, she had also shown that she was capable of something else, something beyond the battlefield. Mark didn't immediately speak. He let the silence hang in the air, allowing the moment to sink in. This was the breakthrough he had been hoping for. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he realized that the gladiator wasn't just a weapon, but a person with choices, with intelligence, with the capacity to change. "Congratulations," Mark said finally, his voice soft but filled with genuine respect. "You've got more than just strength. You've got a sharp mind." The gladiator didn't respond, but there was a brief flicker in her eyes. It wasn't pride, nor was it arrogance. It was something else, something close to recognition. She had understood his words. She had understood that this was more than just a game. This was a moment of acknowledgement. And for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of something new in her, something that hadn't been there before. It was a moment of connection, of understanding. Mark stood up, his body still tense from the intense concentration of the game, but his mind was clearer now. He had broken through. It wasn't just about defeating the gladiator. It was about showing her that there was another way to live, another way to fight. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to be something more than just a gladiator. As the gladiator stood and turned to leave, her chains still rattling, Mark knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But this moment, this breakthrough, had given him something priceless, a reason to hope. She had proven that there was more to her than just violence, and that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. Building trust, an unlikely bond. The days following the game were filled with quiet tension and cautious optimism. Mark Sloan had learned that the gladiator, whose name he still didn't know, was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. She was not just a mindless warrior driven by instinct. She was someone with the ability to learn, to adapt, and perhaps, eventually, to trust. That last part was the key. Trust, something that the gladiator had never known, and something that Mark was determined to help her find. Mark's approach had shifted. No longer did he see her solely as a threat to be neutralized or a prisoner to be controlled. She was more than that. She was a survivor, a creature of immense strength and intellect, but also someone who had been shaped by endless battles and isolation. Her past was one of pain, not by choice, but by circumstance. Mark saw now that if he was going to help her, he would need to meet her where she was, not as a commander and a prisoner, but as two beings, both shaped by their respective worlds. The first step in this delicate process was understanding her. Mark had spent hours poring over any available data about her, trying to get inside her mind, to find out what made her tick. From her fighting history, Mark learned she had been raised in brutal arenas where the strongest and most ruthless survived. Every day had been a battle for her, and every challenge was a test of endurance and violence. In a place like that, trust wasn't just unnecessary, it was dangerous. But here, in this colony, surrounded by humans who weren't enemies, things could be different. The tension between Mark and the gladiator had begun to thaw, but there was still no communication. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was never out of kindness. It was often terse, blunt, and defensive. But Mark had learned something important. Her silence wasn't a refusal to communicate, it was a defense mechanism. She was still measuring him, still wondering if he was like all the others who had used her in the past. One evening, Mark decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to force a conversation or continue with the games, he simply sat beside her in silence. She was standing by the window, her gaze lost in the horizon, her body still and tense. Her chains were no longer as tight as when she had first arrived. She had become more accustomed to the constraints, but Mark knew that her restraint was more mental than physical. For what seemed like hours, Mark just sat there, not speaking, not trying to coax her into anything. He knew from his own experiences that sometimes the best way to build trust was through simple, shared moments, moments when words weren't needed. He finally spoke, his voice quiet and calm. "I know you don't trust me, and I can't blame you for that." The gladiator didn't look at him. Her posture didn't change, but Mark could tell she was listening. He didn't expect her to respond. He didn't need her to. "I've been where you are," Mark continued. "I've fought battles, but they were different from yours. My enemies weren't always physical, but I understand what it's like to feel alone, to feel like everyone around you is either a threat or someone who wants to use you." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air. The gladiator's eyes flickered for a moment, but she didn't say anything. "Back where I come from, we have something called trust," Mark said softly. "It's not given lightly, but it's earned. And right now, I'm working to earn yours. Not because I want something from you, but because I believe there's something more to you than just your past. Something worth saving." Mark stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might startle her. "When you're ready, you can talk. Or not. I'm not going anywhere." The silence stretched for a long time after he left. It was a silence that felt different from before, less strained, less full of expectation. The gladiator stood there, unmoving, but her posture was slightly less rigid. She hadn't made a sound, but something in her demeanor had shifted. Whether it was the simple act of being treated like a person, not a weapon, or whether it was Mark's words that had reached her in some small way, he didn't know. What he did know was that a small crack had appeared in her defenses. The next day, Mark tried something else, a simple gesture of kindness. He brought her a meal, something she had never experienced in the way it was presented. The food was prepared by the colony's chefs, a mix of vegetables and protein, a far cry from the gruel she had been fed during her time in the gladiator pits. He placed the meal before her without saying a word, then stepped back and waited. He didn't force her to speak, didn't demand a reaction. It was a simple offering: food, sustenance, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She didn't take it right away, but after a long moment, she reached for the plate, lifting it with surprising delicacy. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving Mark, as if she were trying to gauge his intentions. For the first time, the gladiator seemed to be doing something that wasn't driven by instinct or anger. She was eating not out of necessity, but out of choice. And in that moment, Mark realized that the biggest obstacle wasn't her chains, or her strength, or even her past. It was her ability to trust. Over the following days, small changes began to emerge. The gladiator, though still guarded, began to interact more. She made eye contact with Mark when he spoke, acknowledging his presence in a way she hadn't before. It was subtle, but it was progress. Mark knew that gaining her trust wasn't something that would happen overnight. It would take time, patience, understanding, and consistency. But he could feel the shift. He could feel her walls starting to crumble, little by little. And that, more than any battle or war, was the real victory. Not the victory of strength, but the victory of understanding. A bond was forming, an unlikely connection between two beings, one forged by violence, the other by compassion. Together, they were slowly building something that had never existed before: trust. Final test: a dangerous battle. The sun had begun to set over the colony, casting long shadows across the landscape. The soft, orange light of the evening made everything feel still, too still. Mark Sloan stood outside the command center, watching as the gladiator, now more than just a prisoner in his eyes, prepared herself for what was about to unfold. The final test was upon them, and there was no turning back. The days of subtle gestures and trust-building had led them to this point. The gladiator, no longer just a savage weapon, had become something else: an ally, a force that Mark knew would change the course of their destiny. But that didn't mean she was ready for what lay ahead. Not yet. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the heavy clank of footsteps approaching. He turned to see the gladiator walking toward him, her chains no longer an obvious burden, but a reminder of her past, of the limitations that had been placed on her. She had been trained for combat. conditioned for survival in the most brutal of circumstances. But Mark was about to test her in a way she had never been tested before. For the first time, she met his gaze without hesitation, her red eyes steady and unwavering. There was something different in her now, something deeper than the raw power she had once relied on. Her body, still massive and intimidating, seemed to move with purpose, no longer just a reflection of violence, but of strategy, intelligence, and even a hint of hope. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The gladiator didn't speak, but the slight tilt of her head, the way her muscles tensed, was answer enough. She was ready, perhaps more ready than Mark had ever hoped. The mission that had brought them to this point was simple in theory: defend the colony from an incoming alien threat. It was a small faction of raiders, far less powerful than the enemies humanity had faced in the past, but the threat they posed was real. They weren't here for negotiation or peace. They were here to conquer and destroy. The Gladiator, despite all her history, would be humanity's final line of defense. But this wasn't just about brute force. It was about the mind, the strategy, the connection they had formed. The final test wasn't simply to defeat the raiders. It was to work together, to see if the Gladiator's newfound understanding of strategy and trust could be the key to their survival. Mark had to trust her, but the Gladiator had to trust humanity too. It was a partnership forged through understanding, through the shared experiences of challenge and growth. The raiders' ships appeared on the horizon, their sleek, aggressive forms cutting through the sky with terrifying speed. Mark felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but this time it was different. He wasn't leading a team of soldiers into battle. He was standing beside someone who had once been his enemy. And now, she was the only one who could help them survive. The battle began swiftly. The Gladiator's strength, combined with the training she had received on the battlefield, made her a force to be reckoned with. Her massive frame moved with surprising agility as she charged into the fray, her chains rattling with each powerful step. Mark had never seen anyone fight like this before, no one with such raw, unrelenting power, yet such incredible focus. Mark coordinated the colony's defense, giving orders to his team, watching as they scrambled to hold off the raiders. But all the while, his eyes were on the Gladiator. She wasn't just charging into battle. She was thinking. She was using her knowledge of tactics, anticipating the movements of the enemy. Her mind, so long honed for survival, was now her greatest weapon. As the battle raged on, Mark saw the turning point. A group of raiders attempted to flank their position, thinking they could overwhelm the human defenses. But they hadn't counted on the Gladiator. With precision and ferocity, she moved swiftly, cutting off the raiders' escape route and taking them down one by one. Her blade was a blur, her movements almost surgical in their execution. And all the while, Mark watched from behind, giving commands, but allowing her to take the lead. The final wave of raiders came charging forward, their numbers overwhelming, but the Gladiator was ready. She didn't wait for orders. She moved as if she had known this battle for a lifetime. Each strike, each decision, made with confidence and purpose. She was no longer the wild animal bound by chains. She was the apex predator, calculating and unstoppable. The raiders didn't stand a chance. As the last of them fell, Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had known the Gladiator was capable of great things, but seeing her in action, seeing her fight with both intellect and strength, was something else entirely. It wasn't just a victory of might. It was a victory of trust, of partnership, of humanity's ability to inspire even the most battle-worn soul to become something more than they had ever been before. When the dust settled, Mark walked over to the Gladiator. She was standing tall, her chest heaving from the exertion, but there was no bloodlust in her eyes. There was no anger, no rage, just a quiet understanding, as though she had found her place in the world once more. "You did it," Mark said, his voice filled with respect and admiration. The Gladiator nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She had done it. She had not only survived, But she had thrived. She had overcome the conditioning of her past, using everything she had learned to protect those who had once been her captors. And in doing so, she had proved something far more important than any victory in battle. She had proved that she was capable of change, capable of trust, capable of being something more than just a weapon. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of respect and camaraderie. "We're in this together." For the first time, the gladiator offered him something, an almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. The final test was over, but this was just the beginning. Together, they had faced down the unknown, and together, they had triumphed. The gladiator had found her purpose, and Mark had found an ally in the most unlikely of places. And as the sun set over the colony, both of them knew one thing for certain. This was a victory not just of strength, but of the human spirit. And together, they were unstoppable.